There's really nothing in the world like Pride Sunday at MCC Toronto. Last Sunday afternoon, I was thinking to myself, I spent 4 years in seminary studying Greek and Hebrew and theology and liturgy and church history, and here I am in the back of a pickup truck in a rainbow catsuit and iridescent silver platform boots, dancing to the Village People and Chapel Roan. Now, if you'd have told, 20-something-year-old me that this is what ministry was going to look like someday, I would never have believed you. And yet, thanks be to God, right? Well, in spite of all that time spent in the back of that aforementioned pickup truck, my phone, the fitness app on my phone, still claims that I walked 16 kilometers, which if you're not, if you're on the imperial system, that's right at 10 miles last Sunday. Now, I think my phone is probably lying to me just a little. I think it's exaggerating just a touch, but I did walk a whole lot, and even if it wasn't 10 miles, and I did it all in these boots. Which are surprisingly comfortable, honestly. Like, they're really wonderful. 10 miles, thereabouts. I think Pride Sunday is the fullest Sunday of our whole church year at MCC Toronto. Christmas and Easter, they're full in their own ways, but Pride is just something else altogether. In part because I've never walked anywhere near 10 miles on Christmas or Easter. I know it's a long way from the parking lot out to the sunrise service at Ashbridges Bay, but it's not 10 miles. So this whole week after Pride, I've been wondering to myself, what is it that makes our community come alive that way that it did last Sunday and all through Pride? Now, one of the things that we like to say here at the Metropolitan Community Church of Toronto is that we want to be a VIP church. I mentioned this right at the beginning of the service. You know what those 3 letters mean, right? Vibrant, inclusive, and progressive. Yeah. We like to say that there are lots of vibrant churches out there. You could be at one this morning, but they're not at all inclusive, and they're certainly not progressive. And there are churches out there that are inclusive and progressive, but they're not especially vibrant. And we try our best to be right in the middle of all 3 of those things. And this morning, I want to spend some time on just that first word, the V word, vibrant. I want to talk about what it means to call ourselves vibrant. Because after last Sunday, I think it is worth asking, where does all of this vibrance come from? I don't believe that it just happens. It's not an accident. And it's not because LGBTQ plus people just throw better parties than everybody else. That might have something to do with it, but that's not all there is to it. So where does it come from? How does vibrant happen? Well, I think that St. Paul has a bit of an answer for us in his letter to the Romans. And I think Paul points to it in part of that sacred story that I just read a minute ago. We have many parts in one body, he says, but the parts don't all have the same function. Now, many parts, one body, is one of Paul's favorite metaphors. Here he is sharing it with the Christian community in Rome, but just a couple of years earlier, he used almost the exact same language in his correspondence with the Christians in Corinth. Paul was a church person. He had seen churches at their best. He had seen them at their worst. He had seen communities that were flourishing. He saw communities that were fractured. And after years of watching people try to form faith communities, trying to live together, trying to serve together, he kept reaching for that same image, that same metaphor over and over again. A human body. Different parts, different functions, different makeups, different roles, different capabilities, one body. I think that tells us where vibrance comes from. Now, when it comes to our own bodies, vitality and vibrance, it doesn't happen because every part looks the same or because it does the same work. It happens because a whole multitude of wonderfully different parts all cooperate. At their best, they all cooperate. Every part has a place. Every part belongs. Every part contributes to the life of the whole. And when one part suffers, they all suffer. I was walking down by the lake this week in flip-flops and I stubbed my toe. And it's just that one little part of my body, but if you've ever stubbed your toe, you know, if one part suffers, the whole body suffers. Now, let's understand, this story from Romans, this text that I've shared, is not about a worship service with incredible high-energy music. Paul's not talking about a bunch of people dancing down the street in a parade. Those are very dynamic elements, and they're very special. But vibrance really begins when people who are genuinely different begin to discover that they are not simply gathered together, but they belong to each other. Now, Paul is certainly not alone in trying to teach us about community using a visual metaphor. 2,000 years later, another person trying to imagine what vibrant could look like used another powerful metaphor, and it's one that connects pretty directly to our involvement in the parade. Back in 1978, a designer named Gilbert Baker created what has become the most enduring symbol of the 2S LGBTQ plus community. He and a group of helpers dyed strips of fabric in bright colors and then stitched them all together, with each color representing a different aspect of life and hope and identity, and the rainbow flag was born. Now, the design has evolved over the years. Just before his death in 2017, Gilbert Baker himself added some different color stripes to it. New colors and new symbols have been added, not because the old flag wasn't good enough, but because our understanding of who needed to be visibly included has grown and it's evolved over the years. Now, imagine what would have happened back in 1978 if Gilbert Baker had decided that one color was good enough. A lot of flags only have one color. It would have been way easier to sew. It would have been a lot easier to reproduce. It would have been a lot cheaper, but it wouldn't have been the pride flag, right? That flag is powerful and it is iconic, not because every stripe is the same. It's because every color gets to be itself. And together, all those colors are way more than what they could be alone. If they were all the same, it would be a huge red flag in more ways than one. Or maybe a blue flag or orange flag, or, you get the idea. Now, Paul pictures that sort of dysfunction also. Just consider what might happen, he says in Corinthians, if the foot got tired of not being a hand and said, I'm out of here. I'm not going to work anymore. Or if the ear said, I don't like it here because I'm not an eye. Or, Paul invites us to imagine, what would it look like if your entire body was just a giant ear? What would that look like? Well, you'd have no way of knowing because guess what? You don't have any eyes. His point is not just that differences are inevitable, it's that differences are absolutely necessary. We have to have them if we really want to be vibrant. It is essential, Romans tells us, that some folks are teachers, that some folks are preachers, that some folks are good at serving, that some folks are great at encouraging. And today we might add that some folks are singers and instrumentalists, and some are float builders, and some are webcasters, and some are communion preparers, and some are cookie bakers. Thank God for the cookie bakers. And I'll say it again, difference is absolutely necessary if you want to be vibrant. Okay, so there is a challenge that comes with this truth. And that challenge is understanding how to name our differences without turning them into divisions. That's why I've never quite bought into the idea that labels are inherently bad. Sometimes you'll hear somebody say, I don't like all these labels. Why do we have to have all these labels? I like labels as long as we're using them for good rather than ill. I have 2 medical appointments this week, one on Tuesday and one on Wednesday. Now, I could say to myself, I don't like labels. A doctor is a doctor. But if I go to my dentist and get my heart checked out, and then I go to my cardiologist expecting my teeth to be cleaned, I'm not going to receive adequate health care. And then afterwards, if I marched into my pharmacy and said, listen, people are way too obsessed with labels. Look, medicine is medicine. Just give me a bottle of pills and we'll see what happens. I would be in a lot of trouble by the end of the week. Labels are important. Labels are tools that help us understand our world, and they help us understand one another. Gay and lesbian and straight and two-spirit and bisexual and asexual and pansexual, transgender, cisgender, non-binary, gender fluid, monogamous, polyamorous, intersex. Some of those words fit us perfectly. We hear that word and we think, that's me. And some of those words might never fit us, and that's okay. The problem is not the labels. The problem is when the labels stop being about understanding and when they start being about ranking. The problem comes when we start using labels to figure out which members of our community are acceptable and which ones are not. For example, sometimes folks like me have used the label transsexual. Now, that's a word that's been used in a lot of different ways over time, but it tends to describe a person whose transition has included medical intervention, someone who has moved very deliberately from one end of the gender binary to the other in a very embodied and physical way. Other people prefer the term transgender. Some people just say trans. And some trans people experience their lives in ways that engage the gender binary quite directly, while others don't want to have anything to do with the gender binary at all. And so all of these words describe different experiences, different journeys, and different ways of understanding oneself. And the problem's not that we sometimes use different language. The problem, and I believe the threat, is that sometimes we do that. We use those things as weapons. And I've seen that. I have seen the ways that labels can become weaponized. It happens in our own communities. Right within the trans community, I've heard versions of this idea. You know, if it weren't for all those non-binary folks, if it weren't for all those people who just refuse to fit neatly into a gender binary, maybe the world would be more accepting of those of us who do. Now, that kind of labeling has nothing to do with understanding. That kind of labeling is all about hierarchy. It's about deciding who is acceptable, who is respectable, and who is not. Whose dignity gets to be affirmed and whose dignity gets treated as negotiable. This is exactly the kind of dysfunction that Paul shuts down when he writes, "The eye cannot say to the hand, 'I don't need you.'" You know, last week in the afterglow of Toronto Pride, an essay that reflected this very tension popped up in my newsfeed. It's an essay written by a gay Christian man who's well known as an advocate for greater LGBTQ+ inclusion in the church. And in that essay, the writer lamented that support for equal marriage and the broader acceptance of LGBTQ+ people has gotten lower over the past several years. And he suggested maybe we could gain some of that support back if we emphasized some parts of our community and distanced ourselves from other parts of our community. And you know, I can almost understand that instinct. Because sooner or later, every movement for justice has to deal with that temptation. Who's respectable, who's not? Who's acceptable, who's not? Who's going to turn people off? Who's going to appeal to people? But y'all, if we really want to be vibrant, and if we want to take a lesson from Paul and from those earliest Christian communities, we have to stop asking which part of the body will make us look more respectable, and we need to start asking instead, which part can we possibly afford to lose? Now, the world is always trying to convince oppressed communities that they can become safer by becoming smaller and becoming narrower and more homogenized and more palatable. But Paul says bodies don't become healthier by cutting limbs off. They become healthier by learning how every part belongs. And I think that's what Pride reveals for us each year. Pride showcases our vibrance like nothing else. And that doesn't happen because we're all the same or because we've all had the same journey. Being vibrant is not about having the same words for each other or understanding identities in exactly the same way. And it doesn't happen because we all have the same kinds or the same amount of privilege. I believe that we experience vibrance on Pride Sunday because for one full and glorious weekend, we get to see what happens when thousands upon thousands of people who are genuinely different decide that they belong to one another. It is messy. It's just about the messiest thing I have ever seen in my life. There's no doubt about that. But there's no denying that it's also vibrant. And here's the thing. The parade, church on church, that's not our goal. Those things are just the reminder. The rest of the work continues this week and next week and beyond. That work is learning together on an ordinary Sunday in July. It's continuing to choose one another when we're not dancing to Sister Sledge or carrying a great big rainbow flag or when hundreds of thousands of people are cheering for us. It's about being a community where teachers and servants, prophets and encouragers, gay and straight, cis and trans, binary and non-binary, young and old, every race and nationality and culture, every story, every ability, every gift, every calling, when we all discover that we're not just sitting in pews next to one another, we belong to each other. Now, we like to say that we seek to be a vibrant, inclusive, and progressive church. And y'all, vibrance isn't something that we just manufacture. It's not about louder music. It's not about a bigger parade. It's not about a longer flag. Vibrance is what happens when every part of the body knows that it has a place. When every part of the body knows that it belongs. When every part of the body is free to contribute to the life of the whole. So let's never become a community that asks, who can we sideline to make ourselves more acceptable? Who can we marginalize so we can get a few more rights? Instead, let's become more and more the kind of body that keeps on asking, who hasn't discovered yet that they belong here? Because that's where vibrant comes from. That's where life comes from. And I believe that that's where the Spirit of God is calling us. Amen? Amen.